We're doing things a little bit different today because, well, as I mentioned in the assessment, it's Doom. Now, I was flummoxed, in all honesty. I was genuinely surprised when the fourth most requested game for me to ruminate on in the most recent poll from the patrons was Doom. Wasn't sure what to make of that. See, the thing is, the original intent behind the Ruminations was pretty much just to look at the story, characters, themes, all the things that make up a story of a game and really analyze and deconstruct them and try to flesh them out, either to help people think about them more or to, help people enjoy them more, whichever one works. Or both, of course. In fact, one of those complaints I got back in the day, before the Mass Effect 3 thing really took off, was that I would sometimes not talk about the gameplay at all when talking about a game, because that wasn't really the focus, right? Well, because this is Doom, we're going to go ahead and talk about the story first. I'd say spoilers, but it's Doom. So here's your story, okay? These scientists are engaging in experiments with teleportation. They open a portal to hell. Hell invades. You go to try and save them. All your buddies die. Now you have to survive alone and make it out. Now, yes, I know there's a little bit more to that. For the record, I'm not counting the Doom books as continuity, especially since the Doom books themselves don't count themselves as continuity. Lord knows they like to just do whatever, and to hell with the consequences. The Doom books aren't even consistent with themselves, let alone the games. So, it is also worth noting that the games themselves are not 100% consistent, because there's sort of there's no denying that the original intent of Doom was it to be science fiction, technology versus demons. That was literally one of the original tenets of the game. Way back when they were first putting this together, when Carmack and Ramiro and Hall, probably don't remember that name, were putting this game together. And there's other people who had a stake in this, don't get me wrong. I'm just naming the big names. But when they were first putting this together, technology versus hell. So technology versus demons. So there's no denying that they're demons, right? I only mention that because when I started doing some research on the game for this video I'm doing right now, I came across that fact and was actually a little bit surprised by it, because ever since I was much younger, when Doom came out in '93, I was always under the impression that these were aliens. The whole cybernetic technology thing, the whole usage of horrible visceral things as far as the graphics and what they're trying to show you as a way of kind of, psychological warfare. Something that's actually referenced in Doom 3, if you pay attention. But no, they're actually demons, and that's actually hell. Who'd have known? But that's, of course, just... I actually really bring that up to get across the point that the story of Doom is so threadbare as to be basically irrelevant, which is why you're seeing more light here than normal. Normally, when I do these, I turn off my monitor so that I have a nice average series of lighting and you don't see this glare on my glasses. I left it up because I want to quote a few things for you here. You want me to talk about the story of Doom, right? This is a direct quote from John Carmack. Story in a game is like story in a porn movie. It's expected to be there, but it's not that important. This is hilarious considering I was just doing work and research for another game, Earthbound, where one of the things that actually pushed Itoy to actually make that game was he played Dragon Quest, aka Dragon Warrior, the very first one, and said, well, that was awesome, but what I perceive in this new format of gaming is a wonderful medium by which to tell an epic, in-depth story. And I can do better than that, and I'm going to go tell an amazing story through my game, and hence Mother 1, or Mother, Earthbound 0, whatever you want to call it. The contrast there amuses me, and obviously I completely disagree with Mr. Carmack there, but then again, I've never had the hugest opinion of Carmack or Ramiro. Good programmers. Not going to deny that, at least back in their day. Definitely some credit is due. But, yeah. I'm going to try really hard not to reference the whole Daikatana thing here. But there is no denying the fact that the incredible success that it had in this era, and it wasn't just Doom. Some people don't remember that they made a game called Commander Keen, a series actually called Commander Keen just before this. If you've never played it, I actually recommend it. It's surprisingly fun. It's basically a side-scroller platformer, but yeah, they made those. What else did they make? They made, of course, the Wolfenstein series, and gosh, I can never remember. They made quite a few games right before this, but I can never remember. I actually had a list earlier. Oh yeah, and of course they made Shadowcaster, which came out right before Doom. I guess I'm kind of done talking about the story, aren't I? Because there's like nothing else to talk about. I mean, if you really want me to, I can deconstruct it a bit. Okay, let's stretch here. Let's stretch our mental muscles. No, seriously, I do actually have something to talk about. As much as I rag on Doom and the makers of Doom for the it's actually referred to as an excuse plot. In other words, the plot exists as an excuse to get to point B, whether the point B is the gameplay, or in his example, it's the porno, or if it's just trying to get to a message, if they're trying to get if it's like an advertisement, or if it's one of those heavy-handed, symbolism things about, this thing would be bad for America. How many times did we see that in the 80s and 90s? So it's an excuse plot. And it's an excuse to get you in there with a bunch of guns and kill a bunch of things. 2 points, though, that are worthy of note here. Point number 1. The idea was to make it fun to shoot guys. Now, they deliberately chose Nazi Germany for Wolfenstein 3D. Why? Because no one would feel bad about shooting Nazis. That was the actual reasoning behind that. In this, they choose, possessed people and demons and, cybernetic demons and other demons that are possessing other demons. So you won't feel bad about killing them. The idea was literally to try and get across the opposite of what games tend to reach for nowadays with more ambiguity and grayness. Doom is about as black and white as it gets. You're the good guy. They deserve to die. Go. But it was that way on purpose. And as much as I love some graying out of things, it was actually kind of refreshing having something that was pretty flatly black and white. So there is that. The other thing I want to talk about the story is the basic premise is not exactly bad. And in fact, if you pay attention to the way I described it, it might sound a lot like another game called Half-Life. See, the thing is, that concept is something that is interesting story-wise. The idea of it's a story about hubris, really. We have reached too far, done too much. We are trying to learn that which man is not meant to know. I mean, there's a reason the whole Prometheus story became a thing forever ago, and so they're reaching for that kind of ideal. And I feel like that might have been a remnant of what Hall made before. So it's understandable why there's some interest in the way they presented it. Why even at the time I found it at least mildly interesting. And I was actually one of those guys who read the manual because that's where the story was in the manual. There was like no story in the game at all. And was curious about why I was here shooting these alien things that are clearly not demons and definitely not from hell. Let's talk about Tom Hall. Those of you who know anything about D&D, and by D&D I mean Doom, know that Tom Hall quit the id Team reasonably, I'd say maybe like halfway through the development of Doom, maybe more like 2/3 of the way, but basically Tom Hall was in one camp and everyone else was in another camp when it came to design philosophy. Hall created an entire, he calls it the Doom Bible, and it had lots of information on the story. It was going to be much more story-focused, much more character-focused, had a very concrete and cohesive plot. It was going to be very realistic. He did actual research on real-life military bases because he was also doing the level design. And he actually used textures, for the texture mapping, I'll talk about that in a bit, of real life, walls and pictures from military bases as the textures for the game. It's actually kind of funny because Hall was probably ahead of his time because at the time everyone just thought all his stuff was really boring and wasn't going to fit. It wasn't fun. So, yeah, after significant issues with that, he finally just ended up and quit, and I don't blame him. It may sound like I'm on Tom Hall's side because, heavy story focus, blah, 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 right? That being said, I'm not sure that I am. And the reason why is because if Hall had had his way, what we would have had is another PC game of the same type that we'd already had up to this point in time in that era. I'm going to talk about the significance of Doom last. That's going to replace my usual story section. But suffice it to say that if Hall had had his way, I don't think Doom would have exploded the way it would have, which would have had rather significant consequences as far as gaming. But let's go and talk about gameplay of Doom. You move around and you shoot things. No, seriously, let's talk about this for a moment. There were several advancements to the technology, and I decided to pull up a list here so I don't just go off of memory. Because Wolfenstein 3D, I've said this before and I've said this again. I'll say it again. There are three definitions of first in a particular genre or type of game, right? There's the actual first. Most of the games that are actually firsts came out in the 70s, which is why nobody ever cares about that, and why I almost never bring it up. There's the firsts, which is a game that is generally considered to be really the one that started off a genre of game, but wasn't really as popular as the third category, which is the game that made that type of gameplay explode, made it popular. I've got a really, and have actually used this example many times before. The first-person shooter was Wolfenstein 3D, but the one that was popular was Doom. The first real-time strategy game was Dune, to make that clear. But the one that made it popular, or rather the ones, because they came out very close to each other, was Command & Conquer and Warcraft. You know, the originals back in the day, and so forth and so on. This is true for most genres overall. But the point is, Wolfenstein 3D was a serviceable, fun game, and I actually played it when it came out. Doom, they really went to task on the engine, and that's kind of the thing I want to talk about most, because one of the things it has been known for since Doom, actually, is being able to make a really good engine that other people can then make games out of. Id's own games are not exactly bad, and indeed, Doom did kind of start off the PC gaming thing, as I'll talk about later, but I can't point to any id game personally that I would put in the top 100, because they're good games. I will probably never play Doom again. I only replayed it this time for the Rumination. So it was like, yeah, okay, it's a serviceable game, it's a popcorn game, I'm with it, I enjoy it, and then I put it down. I'm actually kind of being facetious here, I'll talk about that in a minute. I wanted to talk about that first, but I don't want you guys to stone me with sticks just yet. It's funny, though, in hindsight, especially speaking as a programmer, and especially speaking as someone who was really going to school for programming a few years after this came out, because I look at the changes between Wolfenstein 3D, which I'm going to pull up this list now for, and Doom, and it's hilarious. For example, in the Doom engine, you could have height variance in objects. Now, that may sound so simple, but again, this is when three-dimensional things were basically just now becoming a thing in gaming. And so the ability to render an engine that has something on a Z, it actually acknowledges a Z-axis at all, and then actually allows you to move it like that, was completely new. The non-perpendicular thing. Look at the maps for Wolfenstein 3D sometime, the original. Every line is just the four cardinal directions. In Doom, they could do angles and stuff like this to make all sorts of stuff for the areas. Furthermore, they actually allowed something that is going to sound hilarious as an innovation: texture mapping. Now, if you don't know what that means, in Wolfenstein 3D, all the surfaces, all the objects, walls, ceilings, etc., were monochromatic, were colored. But in Doom, they had made it so the engine can actually render an image file over this object. So instead, you could actually have a texture here. I mean, it's such basic stuff that I just eat up, and admittedly, I'm trying really hard not to geek out about it too much, but honestly, I feel like this is the second biggest contribution Doom had to gaming, was the introduction of this engine, which of course brings me to the brilliance of John Carmack. While I disagree with the man in many ways, I do have to give him credit. For those of you who don't actually understand programming, I'm going to fail at explaining this. If you know what I'm talking about, and indeed many of you probably know what I'm talking about better than I do, he had to use a trick to make Doom run on PCs of the time. Now, most games did. The most commonly done trick in all of existence, I've been doing since gaming has been a thing, is don't render what's not currently on the screen, right? Don't waste processing power rendering something that is not currently being visible. Games have been doing that since forever. It's only much more recently that games have actually started rendering stuff behind you so that, it's a smooth transition when you whirl around, that kind of a thing. But back then, the Doom levels aren't actually three-dimensional. It's a single plane, right? Anything that is a height variance, anything that uses that brand new z-axis is actually being stored separately over here. And so it makes it so that areas seem large because when it goes to this, it renders it up like this, even though it's not actually there. If you were to actually look at the game in terms of the game's interpretation of it, it's all fully flat, right? I'm failing so hard at explaining this. But when he used this trick, it made it so that everything can be rendered very, very quickly and with very little processing power required, which is why so many games could run, so many systems could run Doom. It's also probably at least partially responsible for the fact that Doom can run on virtually anything. I knew a guy who had Doom on his watch. Doom's been on a cash register before. Fully playable. Still not impressed? A guy got Doom to run on a printer. I don't know what else to add to that. So, the other thing that they did with Doom was they really began the modding community as being a thing in PC gaming. One of the things that PC gaming has basically always had over consoles. Not getting into the Versus thing, don't even start with that. But one thing that has always been different about PC gaming is that they have modding as a huge feature of the game. The Morrowinds and Grand Theft Autos and all that fun stuff are good examples of this, but that all really comes back to Doom. Now, people had modded Wolfenstein 3D and a few other games prior to this. It was semi-common, especially for people like me, admittedly, who just liked pulling apart the code and seeing what we could do. Doom was made modular, basically. They introduced WAD files. I'm sure you know what that is. WADs, where all of it is, what's that stand for? Hang on. There's where's all the data? That's what it stands for. I know it stands for something stupid. WADs. The game was deliberately designed so that just about everything was pulled in expendable. So all you'd have to do is find the WAD of whatever you wanted to change that, and the game would load it normally. Now, that may seem like such a small deal again today, but at the time, a game that supported modding, this was basically the first game to really do that, and definitely the first widespread game to do that. That was a huge deal. That being said, I'm going to go ahead and talk about a few things which is going to make you want to stone me and kill me with sticks. There's nothing else for it. Now, first of all, I don't actually like Doom that much. I never did, even when I was younger and it first came out. And I can explain why very simply. I don't like shooting gross things and watching their blood go everywhere. I'm not a gore person. I never have been. I've talked about this before. It's one of the reasons why I avoid so many horror games and horror games like Dead Space, because Dead Space's big appeal is it's incredibly violent. I'm not going to talk about the story, but the point is it's incredibly violent and incredibly graphically gory, and I don't like that. I never have. So I actually did play all the way through Doom as a kid, but it was in very much bits and pieces over the course of like a year, because it was just like, and I just had to take breaks every now and again. And that was true now, too, because I find myself playing this game and just going, ugh. I actually was severely tempted to go ahead and mod the game and pull in one of the many 7 trillion or so graphics mods just to make it so that I could just play the game. But no, I wanted to have the legit experience, which is why I'm telling you this now, because I know I am not alone in that. Now, that being said, most gamers, percentage-wise, are totally okay with gore. And there is a percentage of gamers who actively want gore. Like, that's an appealing thing to them. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I know that there are several gamers who probably didn't like Doom, and as a result didn't get into either PC gaming or first-person shooters nearly as much as they would have back in the 90s, because their first exposure to that was Doom. And they were just like, ugh, you know? Now, that being said, The other thing I don't like about Doom is the controls. Now, yes, I know you can mod it, you can rebind it, but again, I wanted the default experience. And, well, okay, as close as to default as it could, because I actually couldn't run Doom without custom modding a few things to make it run Windows 7, modern. This is a very common problem. But, and I was using the Steam version, by the way. Speaking of which, thank you, Bregman, for that donation. WASD goes forward and back and strafes arrow keys to turn. That took a lot of getting used to. Now, I know what you're saying. Why didn't you just use the mouse? The mouse was almost worse, because the mouse overrides the keyboard, okay? And mouse you can use to strafe, or turn, turn, but if you go forward or back even a little, that makes you actually go forward or back. In other words, you're supposed to control it entirely with the mouse or entirely with the keyboard. Doing both, which is how I normally play FPS games, didn't work at all, because again, mouse overrides keyboard, so every time I would twitch even a little bit forward or back, whatever I was doing as far as movement wouldn't work. So it took me several levels of failing miserably. And I actually had to turn the difficulty down, which was just embarrassing until I got used to the game, so that I could actually play the game properly. That being said, the game did do several things interestingly gameplay-wise. First of all, it has a very minor form of tactics, because there are basically two types of weapons in the game, arguably three. And this is true for you and the enemies both. There's hit scan at weapons, I'll talk about that last, but there's projectile weapons, which is a projectile goes, and if it collides with the object, it does damage to it. And then there's explosive weapons, which are also kind of Now, the reason this is interesting is because hit scan weapons obviously have the benefit of immediately hitting. A hit scan refers to the fact that if I shoot, at something here, the moment I hit the button to shoot, it scans my line of sight and sees that I'm connecting with it and immediately does damage to them, basically. There is no projectile, there's no delay, it's just boom, instant, right? So there's obvious benefits to that because you immediately hit whatever it is, but most of the hit scan weapons, with a few exceptions, do less damage. Unless, of course, they give the enemies hit scan weapons specifically to make them more dangerous. The spider demon comes to mind immediately for something like that. Yeah. Then there's the projectile weapons. Now, the projectile weapons usually did more damage, but of course they can be dodged, and they have to actually pass over to there. So while your projectile is moving over to them, or vice versa, you can be shooting them, or vice versa, and basically kill the other person before the projectile even reaches them. Especially given the fact that projectile speed was still kind of slow thanks to engine limitations, right? And then, of course, there's explosives. Now, explosives, you'd be wondering why that's even a tactical consideration. Several enemies in Doom actually do not take explosive damage at all. That means if you're using an explosive weapon, like the rocket launcher, you have to make a dead-on hit, and that will do the damage, because that explosive damage that's hitting the nearby will not do anything to them at all. And actually made a lot of enemies more difficult than otherwise they would be. So again, kind of a tactical choice thing. Now, God, what else do I have to say about the gameplay? It's Doom, I feel so flummoxed here. It's like, what do I talk about? When I first was looking at this, I was just like, I don't know what to do about this. This is so weird. It's Doom. I'd be remiss if I didn't give out the usual tidbits that some people may or may not be aware of. For example, let's just say it was interesting the sources they would use to make the graphics for this game. They actually made some clay models and some latex and metal models, which were then photographed to give the different to be rendered into sprites in order to be used in the game. And they got some Toys R Us guns and toys in order to be, again, take a picture of it at the right angle and then try and do a digital version of that for the shotgun and whatnot. They just used all sorts of stuff. It's kind of funny. That stuff still is done today, but it's interesting because the reason that kind of stuff is done today is because people like id Software kind of started that as a thing. Wow, okay, I guess we're kind of done talking about gameplay. This is going to be a short one, guys. Sorry, it's Doom. Let's talk about the significance of Doom. I mentioned this would be last. This is what I really have to talk here. We'll go ahead and give you the contrast. We'll go ahead and hit the monitor so you can see what I mean about the lighting. Let's talk about the significance of Doom, shall we? One of the weirdest questions that I have heard only a few people ask is, why was Doom so popular? And it is a valid question. It's a valid question in just about any case where something like that happens. The most common answer is, well, because it was good. And yet, as I mentioned, Doom itself was okay. I'm trying to think. Doom was only about halfway well received by the gaming audience at the time. That's not why Doom became so popular. That's not why Doom had such a lasting impact on the industry. That's not why Doom is considered one of the pinnacles of gaming to this day. It's because of its timing. When this game came out, 1993, several key factors were happening. Number one, computers were becoming easier to use. They were becoming more commonplace in households. They were becoming cheaper. And using a computer to play video games, which until this point had been pretty much the purview of, the NES, basically, was starting to become a thing as well. And in this burgeoning time of, okay, now we're starting to get to the point where PC gaming is becoming a thing. Before you pointed out, yes, I know PC gaming was a thing before this. Again, all the way back to the 70s, if you really want to get into it. That's not my point. My point is, up until this point in time, up until Doom, PC gaming was a minor little... It was a niche. It was a quiet thing. And I say specifically PC gaming because console gaming had started becoming big at this time too. Again, after the last time it got big. But PC gaming, that was rare still. That was its own little niche culture over here, off into the side. And then with computers spreading more and more, and the availability of using them for gaming, and the societal and cultural acceptance of using a computer for a video game entertainment, system kind of a thing becoming more common, then Doom comes out. Doom comes out. It's fun, it's quick, it's easy, you can pick it up instantly. There is almost no delay time in understanding what's going on. It doesn't get hard until much later. This is very important. And it doesn't get all visceral and horrible until much later. That's also important. Because it means for that first thing, there's one other factor here, but I'll get into that in a moment. For that first bit of gameplay you're playing, it's fun. It's quick. It's easy. You're just going around shooting things. It was... this is going to sound like an insult, but I swear I don't mean it like it. It was McDonald's. It was something you could rely on, something you could get quickly and easily, and something you knew how to do. And it was accessible and available, and it was wherever you went. You could just sit down and play for a few minutes if you wanted to. And all of these features came together to form a game that a lot of people could play. Not just gamers, and not just PC gamers. This is why Doom became a big thing. Now, I mentioned there was one last thing, and that's a thing called shareware. Nowadays, we actually kind of use the word shareware differently, but back in the day, the term shareware meant, here is a full demo of the game. It's usually a decent chunk of the game. It's free. Usually you'd find it on floppies or 3.5s, or you could download it if you happen to be one of those weirdos who actually had a good modem in it, and at the time, a good old 14.4. Actually, I guess there was a 28.8 at that point, but the point remaining, shareware was basically free. Now, the way it worked is, if you liked it, there was mailing instructions and whatnot in there, so you could go and mail for a full copy, send them a check or cash, because sending cash to the mail was a little more common back then too. And they would mail you a full copy of the game. So, on top of everything else, ease of use, ease of playability, lots of fun for the first area, doesn't actually get frustrating or difficult until the second act, really, and it ends on a cliffhanger while I'm on the subject, and no real visceral horribleness that goes, to the point where it's actually going to offend people who would be offended or hurt or otherwise find that a negative, like myself, in any of those points, and it's free! Of course Doom exploded! Now again, most games were shareware at the time, but you get the point, right? So a lot of people played that and bought Doom, bought the whole game, because of course they did. Doom, I would argue, was single-handedly responsible for PC gaming leaving the point of being a subculture and becoming a culture on its own. As I mentioned, it had huge modding support, And that was already a thing by that point in time, but actually supporting modding made it so that modding went up a step too, and was no longer just the few geeks and programmers who were really into it, but people were, because it was so much more accessible, more people were willing to try it. This is a similar thing that Bethesda would do much later. Well, not much later, a couple of years later, but you get the point. And all of these factors explain why Doom has such a pivotal point in our history as gamers. Like I said, I don't really like Doom, but I cannot deny its value and reason into why gaming evolved the way it did. What would it have been like if Doom hadn't come out? Now, you might say any other games that came out in the era might have had the same impact, and that is a valid point. But Doom was so unique because it wasn't just at the right time, it was at the right time and had all the right features. Everything I just listed previously that contributed to that. And I don't know, I mean, as someone who has been a PC gamer since before Doom, and as someone who has been a gamer since before, Mario Brothers, I am actually glad Doom came out and changed the fabric of our culture, of our society, the way it did. I'm only really talking about Doom here, but I do have to stress that's when everything went wrong, basically. The reason I say that is because Doom was surprisingly successful. And okay, there's no getting around this. Several of the more egotistical members of id Software predicted from the get-go that Doom would blow everyone away. And then it did. They were right. That was a bad thing. Because that fueled their ego 100-fold more. Now, Doom 2 came out very shortly thereafter. Doom 2 is what we would refer to as an expansion pack in older games, or in older eras, or a DLC nowadays. It really was literally just, there was no engine changes, none at all that I'm aware of, actually. And it was just more missions and more stuff to do. It was... I'm not yelling about that, by the way. I'm actually the kind of person who's in favor of that as long as the new content is fun. But, Doom 2 came out and that sold very well. Of course it did. And then certain individuals, who I will not name, decided to start acting like they were rock stars in a stereotypical 70s and 80s kind of a way in the mid-90s when they weren't rock stars. This is also something that a certain individual, Bill Roper, also had a problem with, where he insisted that gaming developers should be treated like celebrities. Now, don't mistake, most gaming developers are treated like celebrities, but more of a, oh my god, it's awesome to meet you, can you talk about this thing? Especially since a lot of game developers tend to be pretty cool people. But what Roper meant, and what Romero, I wasn't going to say his name, what the other individual meant, was they should be treated like celebrities, like people constantly trying to get their autograph and take their picture and being hounded by, people. They wanted that kind of a thing. But that is attitude and hubris that gamers in general don't really like, because we don't want to follow you around like that. Now, granted, I'm speaking generalized here, but the point is trying to appeal to a group of people who like video games in general by treating them like you would treat your fans if you were that kind of a celebrity, aka poorly, is not the kind of thing that we generally are going to tolerate. Especially back then, when gaming was still finding its footing and figuring out exactly what's going on. So, yeah, let's just say that when Daikatana finally came out, certain people were fully expecting it to be a complete flop, and weren't surprised when it was. Which makes you wonder, though, this is the real reason I'm bringing all this up. Was it a fluke? Was Doom literally a fluke? I don't actually think it was, and I tend to refer to this actually as the Ultima factor. I know, I'm talking about Doom, but the Ultima series, when it came out, was pretty revolutionary and did a lot of things code-wise and under the hood that were very new for the time and helped start PC gaming RPGs as a thing. And I acknowledge that, definitely. The problem is the people who coded the Ultima series after a certain point, and I'm sure you fans of the Ultima series out there know which point I'm talking about, stopped trying to innovate, stopped trying to keep up with the times, and just kind of kept leaning on their old experience from back when that was relevant, even though it wasn't anymore. They were great at what they were doing, designing code-wise, back then. Now the field has changed. Now we need to evolve and work forward in order to keep up with everything else. And they didn't. And this is the same problem a lot of people with id made, and with Ion Storm made, because they were good back then. And that's why I say I don't think it was a fluke, because they were good back then. For this era, for this level of technology, they were brilliant. But you fast forward 10 years, and all of that knowledge and information is completely out of date. Anybody who does anything about technology knows just how fast and quick and hard programming and general software operating systems, and I'm actually those separately because of how different it is from general software and hardware, changes constantly. I myself have fallen so far out of date with coding that at this point I don't actually trust myself to program anymore. Maybe do programming design, but that's it. Because I've fallen out of the loop. I have reached that point that they did. But again, the point is, I don't think it was a fluke. I do think they were brilliant for their time, and I do give them definite kudos for helping us get to the era we have reached that has now surpassed them. And I admit I am even a little bit curious about the new Doom, Doom 4, or just Doom, because that's the thing nowadays, is just calling it original title. Mortal Kombat, Tomb Raider. There's other examples. We'll see. One final note I want to make here. This is the last thing I'm going to talk about, I swear. I gave thanks. I gave a thank you to Brigven for donating this copy of Doom so I could do this rumination, and I definitely mean that, because I sure as hell wasn't going to buy it. Now I know what you're thinking. Oh, you pretentious bastard! Yeah, go ahead and sure. I'm not really doing that financially well. I am capable of meeting my needs, and that's basically it. Forking over $15 for a game that came out in 1993 just made me raise an eyebrow. That wasn't even on Good Old Games or anything. That was on Steam, new, quote unquote. $15. That really struck me as weird. Maybe this is just me. I don't know. Maybe it's just because I didn't like the game that much. Because if you asked me to fork over $15 for, I don't know, Master of Orion 2, that's not even that old. What's an older PC game from that era? Well, I guess Wolfenstein 3D, but that's not a good example. The point is, $15 struck me as just a little bit head-tilting. It wasn't actually expensive. It's just odd that they're still charging that kind of a price for it. The reason I bring this up is I went looking for abandonware or shareware versions of Doom in order to play it for this rumination. It wasn't abandonware, and it wasn't available on any of the sites that usually track that sort of thing or have games that are available for free nowadays. Which is why I was so grateful for that donation. Just weird in its own right. It is probably me feeling too much into this, and yes, I say feeling, not thinking, but I find myself wondering if it's that same egotism that keeps it there. We're id, this is Doom, pay for our game. As opposed to, we're id, here's our game, please play it. The difference in attitude is what I felt was the reason for that. Anyways, that's it, all I've got. Sorry for the short one. It's Doom. What do you want from me? Hopefully I will be back next week with another game to ruminate on, which I will have a lot more to talk about, for good or for bad. I'll see you there, guys.